It happened at 2:14 p.m. The room was standard. The lighting was artificial, fluorescent, and constant. There were 6 people seated around a table that was slightly too large for the group, creating distances that felt intentional. The conversation had been flowing. A rhythm of statement, response, agreement. Statement, response, agreement. It was the predictable cadence of people who believe they are on the same side, or at least pretending well enough to finish the hour. Then a question was asked. It was not a hostile question. It was logistical, a minor detail about a timeline. The person at the head of the table, the one who had been leading the tempo, did not answer immediately. Usually a pause lasts 2 seconds, maybe 3. That is the social contract of conversation. You speak, I process, I reply. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then 10. The silence that followed was not empty. It was not a void. It was a physical weight that settled over the polished wood of the table. No one moved. At the 15-second mark, the atmosphere changed density. Before the pause, the air in the room felt light, circulated by the quiet hum of the ventilation system. Now the air seemed to stop moving. The man to the right of the leader shifted his weight. It was a subtle adjustment, a leaning back into the mesh of his chair. The fabric made a low, crinkling sound, a sound that would have been inaudible 2 minutes ago, but now rang out like a shout. He froze mid-movement, realizing the noise he had made. He placed his hands flat on the table, palms down. This is a grounding gesture. It is what people do when they feel the floor shifting. Across from him, a woman looked down at her notebook. Her pen was hovering over the paper. She wasn't writing. She was looking at the ink on the page, as if deciphering a code. She was avoiding eye contact. To look up would be to acknowledge that something was wrong. To look up would be to demand an answer that wasn't coming. So she stared at the paper. Her blink rate increased. The leader remained still. He was not looking at his phone. He was not looking at his notes. He was looking at a point on the wall, just above the heads of the others. His expression was not angry. It was not confused. It was simply vacant of the need to please anyone. This lack of urgency creates a specific type of panic in a group. Human beings are wired for feedback loops. When we send a signal, we expect a return. When the return is withheld, the brain interprets it as a threat. The group's collective amygdala began to fire, quietly, invisibly. At 30 seconds, the silence began to degrade the social hierarchy. Normally, in a meeting like this, there are sub-leaders. People who jump in to smooth over rough edges. People whose role is to clarify, to bridge gaps. One of them, a man in a blue shirt, opened his mouth. He took a breath, preparing to speak. Perhaps to rephrase the question. Perhaps to make a joke to break the tension. He took the breath, held it for a split second, and then exhaled without speaking. He had looked at the leader and decided against it. The risk was too high. To speak now would be to interrupt a silence that felt deliberate. It would be an act of insubordination against the quiet. He closed his mouth and looked at his hands. He began to pick at a hangnail on his thumb. A small, nervous, self-soothing motion. The ventilation system clicked off. The sudden absence of white noise made the silence absolute. You could hear the breathing of the person next to you. You could hear the faint buzz of the overhead light fixture, a sound usually drowned out by the day. Someone swallowed. The sound was wet and loud. Eyes darted. The participants were no longer looking at the leader. They were looking at the neutral spaces, the corner of the whiteboard, the pattern of the carpet, the rim of a coffee cup. They were hiding. In this moment, they were not colleagues. They were individuals trapped in a shared discomfort, stripped of the professional masks that usually allowed them to function. The mask requires dialogue to stay in place. Without dialogue, the mask slips. You could see the fatigue on the face of the older man at the end of the table. Usually, he projects energy. Now in the stillness, his face sagged. He looked his age. He looked tired of sitting in rooms like this. You could see the insecurity in the posture of the youngest person there. She had crossed her arms tight across her chest, a classic defensive shield. She was physically making herself smaller, trying to occupy less volume in the room. Time became distorted. A minute of silence in a library is nothing. A minute of silence in a heated negotiation is an eternity. The leader finally moved. He did not speak. He reached out his hand slowly and picked up a glass of water. The movement was hypnotic. 6 pairs of eyes tracked the glass. They watched the water slouch against the sides as he lifted it. They watched the condensation on his fingertips. He took a sip. He set the glass down. The glass hit the table with a dull thud. Everyone waited. Surely now he would speak. The drink was the preamble. The pause was the preparation. He did not speak. He folded his hands back on the table and returned his gaze to the spot on the wall. The confusion in the room deepened into something colder. It wasn't just awkwardness anymore. It was a display of dominance. By withholding the response, he was controlling the reality of the room. He was forcing 6 intelligent, capable adults to sit in a state of suspended animation. He was showing them that their time, their anxiety, and their need for resolution mattered less than his choice to do nothing. A notification pinged on a phone face down on the table. A double vibration. In a normal meeting, someone would check it, or apologize, or ignore it casually. Here, the vibration sounded like an alarm. The owner of the phone, the woman with the notebook, flinched. She reached out and covered the phone with her hand, smothering it, as if to silence a living thing. She did not check the screen. She just held her hand there, pressing the device into the wood. The tension had reached a point where physical movement felt difficult. Muscles were tensed in anticipation of a release that wasn't arriving. Shoulders were hiked up toward ears. Jaws were clenched. It is exhausting to wait. It burns energy. The sunlight on the floor moved. A slow, creeping angle of light shifting as the afternoon progressed outside. The world outside continued. Traffic moved. Pedestrians walked. But inside the room, time had pooled and stopped. Finally, the leader blinked. He took a deep breath through his nose. He looked down at the table, then up at the group. He looked at each person, one by one. When his eyes met theirs, they didn't challenge him. They looked relieved. They looked grateful that he was acknowledging them. The abuse of the silence had worked. They were desperate for any signal, even a dismissive one. He looked at the person who asked the question. "I don't know," he said. That was it. 3 words. Flat, monotone, unapologetic. He didn't explain why he didn't know. He didn't promise to find out. He didn't apologize for the wait. "I don't know." He began to gather his papers. He stacked them efficiently, tapping the edges against the table to align them. The meeting was over. The group sat frozen for 1 beat longer. The transition was too abrupt. They had been bracing for a speech, a revelation, a reprimand. They got nothing. Then the rustling started. It was frantic. The sound of zippers, chairs sliding back, papers being shoved into bags. The noise was excessive, compensating for the quiet. They needed to make noise to prove they still existed. They stood up. They did not make small talk. There were no see you laters or good meetings. They walked out of the door in single file. The leader remained seated. He watched them go. He did not look up as they passed. He was checking his watch. The room emptied. The door clicked shut on the hydraulic arm. Inside, the leader sat alone. The chair opposite him, where the question had been asked, was pushed back at an odd angle. A pen had been left behind on the floor. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't heavy. It was just empty. The leader picked up the pen from the floor. He clicked it once, twice. He placed it in his pocket. He stood up, turned off the lights, and walked out. The room was dark. The hum of the ventilation system clicked back on.